spent 2 weeks digging a ditch, and when we went back next year, the rains had come, and of course, covered it in. So,
unless you were born in the Orange Free State, and some of the Indian women used to get on the train when they were about to give birth, and then you could be.
Yeah, but yes.
You could
well,
be.
you may be, but you certainly couldn't move into.
No, you couldn't move in, but if you were born there.
Could, yes. But they wouldn't have been born because they weren't allowed to live there.
No,
so they would have been.
If they were passing through.
Oh, passing through.
Yeah.
So if you happen to be on the train, I see.
Yes, I know,
okay.
and they
it's
would.
Crazy. It's a crazy mixed up.
Make sure
world.
they were about to give birth.
So Henry came to me with a great big smile one day. He said, because he had to camp on the South African side of the border, sleep in the car because they got there too late to get through the border post. Huge smile. He said, I've made it. I've slept one night in the Orange Free State. And he was delighted. Desmond Tutu is a name that's familiar to you all. It was said at the time in the 70s when he became Archbishop, there are two types of Anglicans, two types of people, if you like. There are those who know and love Desmond Tutu and those who've never met him. Quite a nice comment on that. My own little story with Desmond, I first met him in 1977. He'd just become the Bishop of Lesotho. He was only there for 8 or 9 months before he went on to other things. But when my wife Christine was heavily pregnant with our second child, he happened to pass through the town we were living in, and we met him briefly, and because Christine was pregnant and his daughter was pregnant at the time, they got chatting. And I saw him a bit later, a couple of months later, and said, "Frank, how's Christine? Has she had the baby yet?" Not yet. Just a few weeks later. Several months later, he met my father for the first time. He said, Derek Nelson, how's your new granddaughter?" And he was that sort of person who just warmed to people and remembered people's names. Another story about Desmond involves a Boer, an Afrikaans woman. Marietta and I attended a course in London for a few weeks, and she desperately wanted to meet Desmond Tutu. She came from an extremely politically conservative right-wing family. Her father-in-law, in fact, was one of the members of what was known as the Broederbond, the conservative sort of secret organisation that probably certainly alleged to be running the country. And we knew that Desmond Tutu was going to be at Southwark Cathedral, so I said, well, let's go along. I know him a little bit. I can introduce you. And we did. And he was absolutely tickled pink. He said, here we are, two South Africans have to come all the way to London to meet each other. And I took a lovely photograph of the two of them, sort of arm in arm. Some months later, I said to Marietta, when I saw her again, I said, when you got back and you showed all these photographs of this trip, what did you say about this photograph with you and Desmond Tutu? There's no way that she could have really shown that photograph and not got into trouble from her family, particularly her father-in-law. She said, oh, he did see it, and I just said I was at Madame Tussauds. I thought it was lovely. Quick thinking. Nomso and John. Nomso is a Xhosa black woman. John is a white man. They fell in love at a student conference, and of course that was illegal. They're not allowed to get married. They eventually went off to New York, as so many couples like that, or people like that, left the country. Huge brain drain. And Nomso's great dream was to be a doctor. And I lost touch with her for more than 20 years, but I saw her about 6 or 7 years ago, and she was a doctor, interestingly to me, in the military. Because in the 70s and 80s, the South African Defence Force was used as a police force inside the country, effectively as part of the Civil War. And but John was an alcoholic. I think he just, whatever reason, yeah. At much the same time as I got to know Nomso, I also met Lee and Pagamile. Now, the Anglican Church in the late 70s tried to get people to see that actually black and white could live together and it wasn't the end of the world and would happen. And they had a little youth program known as the Nomads, where two people, a black and a white person, would be sent into a community and work with churches and youth groups and so on. And Lee, who'd been at university with me, a white Rhodesian as it was then, in Zimbabwe, and Pagamila, a black African from the Kimberley area. And they were working in the Kimberley area, which is in the far northern Cape, a very dry, arid area where those diamonds are that I mentioned earlier. You can't just pick them up, by the way. One night at a conference, student conference in Lesotho, we were waiting for these two, Lee and Pagamila, to arrive. His nickname was Pax, which, if you know your Latin, means peace. So he was about making peace, bringing peace. But Pagamila had been arrested, detained under the state of emergency laws, and he became one of those statistics of people who jumped from a sixth floor window and died. So we got this news, 100 or so young students, black and white, and it was just absolutely devastating. If you've seen the film Cry Freedom, that would have got here maybe some time ago, story of Steve Biko and Donald Woods. At the end of that film, there's a sort of roll of honour of people who died in detention. You'll see his name there. Ezra was a priest friend of mine. He, a black man, he had spent 5 years on Robben Island at the same time as Nelson Mandela was there. We got to know each other well. His wife, I remember when our children were being born, one of the conversations we had with his wife was about naming them. And she said, "Oh, you white people, you always ask us black people what our names mean, because they have lively meanings, but you don't know what your own name means." And so we took very seriously the naming of our children. Our first one was easy, Stephen. It's a good Christian name, first martyr mentioned in the Bible, and Christian martyr, and it means the crown, the victor's crown. So that was easy. A bit more trouble with our first daughter, because every name that my wife suggested, I'd had a girlfriend with that name. We eventually settled on Gillian, and which is a bit ironic, because Gillian means the long-haired one, and she was quite bald for her first 2 years. But Ezra, later on, after Mandela had been released and things were rapidly moving towards change, Ezra was one of the people who said to me, "Frank, thank you for all the work you've done, but actually we don't need you anymore. You can go home." And I thought, well, where's home? My ancestors came here in 1820. We've been here 150 years. I have no roots at all in the UK. I've never even been to the UK. And I guess in the end, that was one of the factors that said, we'll move on. But that's another story. Jan, Henny, and Rolf, 3 young Afrikaners that I met and spent a lot of time with, got to know and enjoy and like their company very much when we were doing national service together. Every white male in the 1970s and through the 80s was conscripted into the South African Defence Force. You really had 3 choices. You either went and did your time. When I did it in 1973, straight out of school, it was 1 year, and then followed by a 10-year period where you could be called up for up to 3 months service every year over that period. Or you left the country, and thousands of young white men left the country, and there will be many here, there must be even some in this audience, I don't know, that would have been the driving reason. Or you went to jail. And as a conscientious objector, if you belonged to a peace church, a peace church was defined as one that in its constitution said, we will not fight. So the Quakers, for example, and Jehovah's Witnesses, I think the only 2 that I can actually recall. The Anglicans, Roman Catholics, Presbyterians and so on, they ascribed really to the just war theory. So we weren't peace churches. But these 3 guys, Jan, Henny and Rolf, were among the people that I was with. And I was affectionately, they referred to me as our tame Soti, S-O-U-T-I-E. Now when I was at school, we had, I went to co-ed schools, which meant not only boys and girls, but English and Afrikaans speaking. So they were all white kids, but two different language groups. And in the 1960s, at primary school, when we had lunch breaks, we'd play soccer. Good, healthy sort of thing to do. But how do you decide which team you're on? Well, there was no question about it. If you were English speaking, you were on this team, the rooi neck, the red neck, a derogatory term that the Boers gave to the British Tommies, and probably Australian Tommies, who came, not well, they were Tommies, were they? Whatever they were called.
Diggers.
Sorry?
Diggers.
Diggers, yes. Because of their helmets, and apparently the helmet stopped here, and there was a sort of inch or 2 inch strip where they got very sunburned. So rooi neck means red neck. The English term for the Boer soldiers was rock spiders, because they were up on the hills clinging to the rocks, and they couldn't be seen. The British couldn't see them. So in the 1960s, this is 65 years after the end of the Boer War, the Anglo-Boer War, our school break times, we simply divided English speaking on one side, Afrikaans on the other. The rooi necks against the rock spiders playing the game. So I'd grown up with that terminology. I'd never heard Soti. And I eventually plucked up the courage. I said, what do you mean? What's behind this expression Soti? And it took them a while, and probably a good few beers, before they told me. And they said, Soti stands for Soatpil. Any Afrikaans speakers here? Yeah, you know what it means? It's because you English, they said, you English stand with one foot in South Africa and the other foot in English. And you dip your penis into the salt water. Soatpil means salty penis. So I was a Soti. Anyway. Are we going for time?
If we go, well, yes.
Victor, I first met Victor in my second year at university when I went to the Anglican Students Federation conference. Now, throughout the 60s, 70s and 80s, and I presume still then, now, the ASF, Anglican Students Federation, was the only student body that managed to stay together as a multiracial group of people. Every other student body on the campuses divided along racial lines. And it was a real struggle, particularly 1975 was the first one I went to. 1976 was a watershed time in South Africa. Soweto, 16th of June, the students erupted. And really since, from 76 to well into the 1990s, a state of emergency effectively existed. But I met Victor, a black man. We sat down, I remember very, very vividly, we were told, we're all people from different parts of the country, different campuses. Find somebody you wouldn't normally talk to and sit and get to know them. Tell them your story, tell them why you're here. We're all Christian people, Anglicans. We just shared Eucharist, Holy Communion together, this very intimate religious act. And we sat and started talking to each other. And I realized, as he did, that actually when we next met could well be over the barrel, on opposite sides, the barrel of rifles, because he had just come from having time in Mkhonto with Sizwe, the ANC, the Resistance Army, Freedom Army, and I was a conscript in the South African Defence Force. And it was that conversation that led me then to formally become a conscientious objector, knowing that if I was called up, I would go to prison. In the end, I never was called up. And strangely, the Defence Force actually then said, after 10 years, said, we don't want you anymore. And I then thought, I actually need to go and volunteer as a chaplain, and I did. For a short time. It was extremely difficult to do that. But so Victor was part of that process of my own thinking and changing and in a sense being alienated from the white community. I think of another conscientious objector who was at university with me, Ivan, a medical doctor, who at Cape Town University, we find medical school there, Chris Barnard, the first heart transplant, that's where he operated. But Ivan was a CO, conscious objector. He had set up a clinic in the Crossroads squatter camp. This is one of the most notorious of the squatter camps in the 70s and 80s. Frequently bulldozed, built on the flat, very flat land. When it rained, as it does in winter, same as in Adelaide, it's cold and wet and windy, absolutely miserable conditions. There was no medical facility at all. It was effectively a refugee camp, I guess, but people had wooden iron shanties, plastic bags, whatever. No formal roads, no sanitation, no fresh water. And he and other students and recent graduates established a medical clinic. Surely that's national service. But he refused to do his national service and ended up in jail. It then came out when he was in jail, civilian jail, that he was gay. And he had a really, really tough time. I should say, just on the conscientious objector thing, this was only applied to whites, of course, that you were called up for a year or 2 years and you refused to go. So your sentence in a civil court, that means you had a criminal record, was double the time you should have served. And when you came out, you were then called up again. So it could just sort of perpetuate it. It was very tough for an 18-year-old to make that decision. I think of Margaret, a white woman who was a member of the Black Sash. The Black Sash was a white women's organisation, intentionally white, because they said, not because they were supporting apartheid at all, far from it, but they said this is our contribution to the struggle for our black sisters. And in the 1980s, all public gatherings were banned during the state of emergency. 3 people on the street corner was classified as a public gathering, and you could simply be detained for months on end with no access to legal representation or family or anything. You just disappear. And thousands of people disappeared, including many, many children. And the Black Sash particularly picked up in the mid-80s this thing of the children being detained without family. I'm talking 10, 11, 12-year-olds. Wow. Who would simply disappear. I was working at the time as the university chaplain in Grahamstown, it's a little town, interestingly, where my ancestor, the 1820 that I referred to, he settled in there. He was a staunch member of the Baptist church, opened up a shop. He couldn't grow carrots, so he moved to town. And every day at midday, we would ring the cathedral bell as a reminder to people of these kids who were in detention. It was a very small town. There were only 4,000 students on the campus of a university town. The sort of white area on this side of the hill, that side of the hill were the black townships. The contrast in sealed roads and beautiful jacaranda trees on one side, and then just dirt and rubbish and mud. During that time, the military had searchlights stationed on the hill from the white side, and they played onto the township all night. Okay, just playing across this, just keeping an eye on things. I do remember on one occasion going for a walk late at night, and across on the hill, as these searchlights went, there was a fire, and you could see that it was a vehicle on fire, but it was more than a vehicle. It was an execution. The necklace method was one of the tactics that UDF employed to execute people they thought were informers. A whole network of suspicion.
UDF was who?
It was the, if you like, the internal wing of the ANC.
Okay.
So people were. Well, I'll give you an example. We had a crippled man, black man, who came and did 2 or 3 hours work in the garden. I employed him to do that, and he really didn't work, and he didn't do any work. It was a kindness to him. But in the end, I got fed up, and I said, I'm not going to pay you anymore. I can't be bothered. And he said, well, if you don't pay me, I can't pay the rent. And if I can't pay the rent, I'll get kicked out of my little house where I am, or the room that he's hiring. And if I get kicked out, I will go to the comrades, so these were young men, black men in the townships, who had really effectively taken control of the townships. And I will tell them that this person has kicked me out of my house, and they will go and burn that house, and they'll probably kill the people. And then he turned on me and said, and it'll be your fault. So I don't know the rights or the wrongs of it, but that's a very complicated situation to be living in there. Another Black Sash member, like Margaret, was Nancy, Professor of Politics at Rhodes University, first